He's not afraid of nightmares. It's nightmares that are afraid of him. The king whose name is emblazoned on the covers of millions of books around the world. They say he sold his soul to Satan, once being on the verge of death, and now he's in league with it. No one believed in him except his mother and himself, but he proved to the whole world that he knows how to scare. He is the most productive, best-selling, and most filmed author on the planet. He is Richard Bachman. Right? It is the Biographer channel, and today we will tell you whether it is possible to love, respect, and fear one person. It is possible if we are talking about Stephen King. Get comfortable, and let's start. Stephen Edwin King was born in Portland, Maine on September 21, 1947. As it turns out later, it's his favorite state. The child was not just sickly, he was born by a miracle. His mother was recognized by doctors as infertile. Almost from childhood, Stephen has had to wear thick glasses all his life because of poor eyesight. His father, Donald Edwin King, was born in Indiana with the surname Pollock, but growing up, he changed it to a rather bright King. Stephen's mother, Nellie Ruth King, née Pillsbury, met Donald in her youth, and on July 23, 1939, the couple married. For a while, they lived in Chicago with Donald's family. For a while in Croton-on-Hudson, New York, but by the end of the war, the future parents moved back to Maine. After returning from World War II, Donald was a traveling vacuum cleaner salesman. Nellie was fond of writing and piano, but her main occupation was motherhood. You probably know all these jokes about the father who went to buy a pack of cigarettes and never returned. So that's what really happened to Stephen. The father left the family when young King was 2 years old, and since then, Nellie had become a single mother. Nellie raised Stephen and his older brother David on her own, working in the laundry, which caused the family to experience financial difficulties. She was saving on rent, living with her children with relatives. They moved from Scarborough and were largely dependent on relatives in Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, Massachusetts, and even Connecticut. They even dressed the kids, collecting hand-me-downs from the neighbors. I realized early on that life is not a sugar donut. Stephen and David were raised by nannies, a lot of nannies who changed either not from a better life or because they didn't get along with the children. At the age of 4, Stephen remembered only one of them, Eula Bula, who was a big 14-year-old girl with an infectious laugh and capable of slapping. In his youth, King was an avid reader. He remembered, "I read everything from Nancy Drew to Psycho. My favorite was The Shrinking Man by Richard Matheson. I was 8 when I found that. I also loved comic books, and my favorite characters, I can't remember any I'd call beloved, were Plastic Man and his clueless sidekick Woozy Winks." Perhaps already at this age, he first thought about what he wanted to do for a living in the future. It happened when Stephen and his older brother were cleaning the attic at home and came across a box with his father's books and comics. This box gave him inspiration for his future works and a love of horror. Here's how he recalled it in his memoir On Writing. "The box I found that day was a treasure trove of old Avon paperbacks. The pick of the litter, however, was an H.P. Lovecraft collection from 1947 called The Lurking Fear and Other Stories. I was on my way. Lovecraft, courtesy of my father, opened the way for me." Stephen first started writing when he was about 6 or 7. He just copied pictures from comics and came up with his own stories for them. In addition, he loved movies very much, and since childhood acquired the ability to think in images and pictures. According to him, movies on TV were the only interesting entertainment since his childhood was absolutely ordinary. But the TV in the King family appeared later, and it was Tales from the Crypt and other horror comics that scared him for the first time, and he realized that he wanted to do exactly that, to scare others.
I was warped as a child. So a lot of horror comics in my past and a lot of horror movies and that sort of thing, and it warped me as a kid. And
seriously?
It seriously warped me. And the thing is, I think that see, they know.
Although there was a story much more creepy and shocking in the childhood of young Stephen, which seriously affected the psyche of the future writer. One day, after leaving home in the morning to play with friends, King returned speechless and in complete shock. Only later, the family found out that one of his friends was hit to death by a train. But Stephen himself admitted that he didn't remember the events of that day at all. Fear erased the terrible memories that he witnessed. Perhaps the already conscious King remembers the details of the incident, but they are so unpleasant that no one wants to talk about them. When Stephen turned 11, the family finally moved to Durham to his maternal grandparents. From now on, Nellie took care of her children and her parents until their death. She also got a job as a nurse in a local boarding school for the mentally retarded. She liked to take care of those who needed it. Young Stephen attended Durham Primary School. He spent almost the entire first grade at home in bed as he was ill with something that started with measles, a sore throat, and then spread to his ears. He had a temperature of 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and with every sip of water, the pain flashed like a light bulb. One afternoon, his mother called a taxi and they went to the doctor. The doctor, with a huge needle, examined Stephen's ears and promised that it would not hurt, and after that, he pierced the eardrum. It was the worst pain in his life. He didn't trust the doctors anymore. A week later, Stephen had another 2-ear injection. Since the repeated eardrum lancings when I was 6, one of my life's firmest principles has been this: fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Fool me 3 times, shame on both of us. At the beginning of 1954, Stephen no longer treated his ears, but treated his throat. It turned out that it was all about the tonsils that needed to be removed. Fortunately, this time the operation was under anesthesia. That year, his 7-year-old brother got to 4th grade, and Stephen was taken out of school altogether as he missed too much to continue his studies. Stephen was recommended to start studying again next fall. He spent a whole year at home reading various literature. The boy read about 6 tons of comics, read Tom Swift, Jack London's animal stories. Eventually, he read William Golding's Lord of the Flies, whom King loved very much and considered an example of a great novel, and in the future, he referred to it. At some point, he began composing, imitating what he had read. Not knowing the correct meanings of words and some swear words, Stephen used them in his children's texts and at some point decided to show his brilliant creations to his mother. According to King, he had never seen such an expression on her face, and yet she liked it. After finding out from her son whether he wrote it himself, Nellie gave him a notebook and advised him to write something of his own, saying, "I bet you could do better. Write one of your own." Stephen began to practice writing and soon wrote his first 4-page story about magic animals where the main character was a bunny named Mr. Rabbit Trick. Mom liked the story. She thought that this could be published in some book. Stephen wrote 4 more stories about the Mr. Rabbit Trick, and for each he received a quarter from his mother. That way, he earned his first dollar when he was 8 years old. It wasn't until 1958 that the first television appeared in the King house. Years later, in his memoirs, the writer was pleasantly nostalgic about the first programs, like Highway Patrol with Broderick Crawford or the movie Robot Monster. But he was glad that this entertainment appeared in their house quite late. I am, when you stop to think of it, a member of a fairly select group, the final handful of American novelists who learned to read and write before they learned to eat a daily helping of video bullshit. This might not be important. On the other hand, if you're just starting out as a writer, you could do worse than strip your television's electric plug wire. Stephen King wrap a spike around it and then stick it back into the wall. See what blows and how far. At least something similar happened to Stephen and his older brother when David was making a super-duper electromagnet for a school project. Soon on his 11th birthday, Mother gave Stephen his first Royal typewriter. It wasn't new, but it didn't matter to him. A year later, the boy began to send his stories to magazines. He sent his first story to Forrest J. Ackerman's magazine, Famous Monsters of Filmland. The story was not accepted, but Ackerman kept it and many years later even signed it at Stephen's autograph session. Soon, the boy entered Lisbon High School in Lisbon Falls, Maine. He listened to records by Elvis, Chuck Berry, Freddie Cannon, and Fats Domino on a Webcore phonograph, and he continued to write and receive rejections from various magazines. He put a nail on the wall for refusals and began hanging sheets of paper with the title of the story on it. The first rejection was from Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine when he was 14 years old. By the age of 16, this nail could barely withstand the accumulated refusals, which were not so critical and even praised the novice author. So, the then editor of fantasy and science fiction, Algis Budrys, wrote the following: "This is good. Not for us, but good. You have talent. Submit again." But his first published story took place in 1965 in Mike Garrett's Science Fiction and Horror magazine. And although it was originally called I Was a Teenage Grave Robber, the story was published under the title In a Half-World of Terror, and Stephen was awarded the Scholastic Art and Writing Award. Around the same time period when the Kings were still studying at Lisbon High School, Stephen's older brother was frankly bored at school. So he came up with the idea to create a school newspaper, Dave's Rag, which they published together with the help of a mimeograph in their basement. The initial circulation of 5 copies for relatives increased to 50 to 60 ones and was published 1 to 2 times a month. It was something like a local newspaper with its own jokes, which sold well. And Stephen's stories, like The Pit and the Pendulum, inspired by trips to the cinema for horror films, sold even better. He printed them himself and brought them to school for the price of a quarter, and he earned up to $10 per day. He claimed that this time he understood how to make money on fiction. Later in his senior year, Stephen was the editor-in-chief of the school newspaper, The Drum, although he did not really want to do it. The newspaper was not popular, and one day he turned it into a satirical newspaper entitled The Village Vomit. Having arranged a roast for the teachers, Stephen got on the carpet of the director and was on the verge of expulsion. However, his creativity and energy were put to use by appointing him a sports reporter for the Weekly Enterprise newspaper. Its editor, John Gould, taught him what was not taught in school. When you write a story, you're telling yourself the story. When you rewrite, your main job is taking out all the things that are not the story. Write with the door closed, rewrite with the door open. From that moment, school life came to an end, and work and writing came to the fore. In 1966, Stephen enrolled at the University of Maine when his brother David was already graduating with honors. Stephen worked part-time at the spinning and weaving factory of Warumbo and did not particularly like this business. He thought if he didn't enroll, he would go to war in Southeast Asia, but his mother dissuaded him because with his eyes, he is the first one to be shot. Stephen got accepted. In the summer of 1967, at the age of 19, King wrote a short story, The Glass Floor, which sold for $35 and was published in the fall of the same year in the magazine Startling Mystery Stories. This was his first official earnings as a writer, and in the next couple of years the young man sold another story until he unexpectedly broke the bank. King often says that ideas for works come to him by themselves. After working at the Warumbo weaving factory in 1966, Stephen found out that giant rats lived in the basement. He recalled how on July 4th, everyone at the factory was given the right to choose.
A week off without pay, or you can join this cleaning crew. We're going to go down and we're going to clean the basement and the sub-basement where nobody's bothered to clean anything out for years. So I took the week off, and when I came back, this guy I worked with in the dye house said, "Oh man, Steve, you should have been there. It was far out. They gave us hoses, and we went down there, and there were rats everywhere, man. They were jumping out. They were as big as cats, and we washed them down the gullies and, into the Androscoggin River."
He couldn't get it out of his head. In the last semester of college, Stephen remembered about overgrown creatures and began writing a story about rats the size of a dog called Night Shift. And if it started as entertainment for the evening, then after 2 months, the magazine Cavalier bought this story for $200. It's about $2,000 for today. It was the first big fee for one story. Stephen literally took his breath away, and in an instant, he became rich. Of course, his mother knew that Stephen was going to be a writer, but she persuaded him to get a teaching education just in case. He was grateful for the inspiration of 2 university professors, Edward Holmes and Burton Hotlin. Thanks to them, he wrote the Steve King's Garbage Truck column for the student newspaper The Main Campus, and also participated in a writer's workshop organized by Hotlin. During his studies at the University of Maine, Stephen managed to work as a janitor, gas station attendant, and at the university's Raymond H. Fogler Library. By the way, it was there that he once met Tabitha Spruce, whom he mistook for a waitress from a local pizzeria who loved to read books. Working together in the library, Steve fell in love with Tabitha in the fall of 1969 at a poetry seminar when she read her poem. It was beautiful, and Tabitha, according to Stephen, was beautiful too. She knew what she was writing about. Soon, they had a relationship, and it was so strong that in 1970, after graduating from Bachelor of Arts in English, Stephen and Tabitha became parents for the first time. The couple named their daughter, born on June 1st, Naomi Rachel King. They got married in 1971, and the following year, the couple had a second child, a son, Joe King. Naomi constantly suffered from pain in her ears. Joe was healthy, but it seemed to Stephen that he did not sleep at all. The newly minted parents were happy with the children, but the newlyweds complicated their lives since finances in the family have always been an acute issue. Stephen King is now the best-selling author in the world who made a fortune on his work and its film adaptations. But in the early 70s, after graduating from university with a teacher's degree, Stephen simply could not find a job in his specialty. He had to get a job as a laundry worker in Bangor, not far from the family home. This work was especially remembered by the writer as it was full of surprises. Clothes were always dirty, smelled of spoiled seafood from local fish restaurants, but he especially remembered the sheets from the hospital, which were not only wormy. He often come across wrapped surgical supplies, metal vessels, and once even teeth. They stank, which was bad, and they were squirming with maggots, but I washed them and by God they came out clean. Laundry and sometimes sewage have become the second main fear of the horror author after rats. But the most ironic thing about this story was that when he returned home after work to sit down to write, the laundry room served as his working room. Probably because of this, laundry or dirty clothes stained with blood are now and then found in many of King's works. Of course, sometimes Stephen managed to sell another creepy story to some men's magazine, but this money was just as quickly gone as it came. For example, the story The Raft, published in Adam magazine, saved Stephen from not paying a fine. Yeah, once the writer was arrested for stealing a traffic cone. You won't believe it, but it happened after it knocked out the muffler on his car. Stephen got angry and took the cone, after which he was fined $250 for petty theft. Just at that moment, he received a check for The Raft and had to cash it to pay the fine. In the middle of 1971, Stephen finally managed to find a job as a teacher and leave the hated laundry. He was hired as an English teacher at Hampton Academy in Hampton, Maine. All this time, he continued to write and by that time already had 2 drafts: the dystopian novel The Long Walk and the anti-war novel Sword in the Darkness. However, both works were unreleased for a long time. It is worth noting at once the fruitfulness of a novice writer. The volume and pace of Stephen's work remain colossal to this day. Even a full day is not enough to tell about all his writings, because in this video we will touch on the main and most important of his works. And what is your favorite work of the King of Horrors? Pet Sematary? It? Or maybe the Dark Tower series? Be sure to write in the comments under the video. We will be happy to discuss these masterpieces with you. Stephen was glad to finally start earning not a couple of dollars a day, but $6,400 a year. But he did not appreciate the scale of the work. He liked to teach kids, even the most spoiled ones, but it took too much time and effort to attend teachers' meetings and check notebooks. For the first time, writing began to seem like a bad idea to him. The family lived in a trailer in Herman, a city that Stephen considered too beautiful to be the asshole of the world, and rightly called it the armpit of the world. He drove a Buick with a broken gearbox. Tabitha worked in a donut shop. Stephen came home from work so stressed that it felt like he had been connected to the electric chair all week. He seriously wondered who he would be in 30 years. A man with a beer belly falling out of an old tweed jacket with patches on the elbows, thick glasses, and a smoker's cough from thousands of Pall Mall cigarettes. He would carry his 6 manuscripts everywhere and lie to himself that he still had time for them. It was at this moment that Tabitha returned his faith, who, even in difficult times, never doubted Stephen and believed that he would succeed. Writing is a lonely job. Having someone who believes in you makes a lot of difference. They don't have to make speeches. Just believing is usually enough. While working at school, he came up with the cherished idea of a young woman with paranormal abilities, paying attention to the behavior of children, their anger, aggression, and bullying towards other children. King wondered what would happen if all this energy accumulated somewhere. So, he started working on a novel called Carrie. It all started as a story for Cavalier magazine, which he wrote on his wife's portable typewriter. But after writing 3 pages, he evaluated them properly and threw them in the trash under the table. Stephen could not write about women's problems in adolescence on behalf of a female character. Tabitha found these pages, and after reading them, returned them to Stephen with a request to continue the work. She promised that she would help her husband make everything realistic from a female point of view. You've got something here. I really think you do. In the end, King was able to connect emotionally with Carrie thanks to the influence of 2 girls he knew. One was constantly abused at school because of her family's poverty, which caused her to only wear 1 outfit to school. The other was a timid girl from a very religious family. The story turned out to be a 98-page novella, in which Stephen initially did not believe and wrote only for Tabitha. He received a dozen refusals from publishers. Then he rewrote it again, imitating the style of periodicals such as Esquire and Reader's Digest, and sent the resulting manuscript to a friend, editor Bill Thompson. In November 1973, in the wake of the success of the horror novel Rosemary's Baby, Doubleday Publishing House saw the potential in the manuscript, but the writer was asked to simplify the ending, in which Carrie grew demonic horns and destroyed a plane 1,000 miles away. Stephen's mother was very ill with cancer by that time. She died too early to have time to rejoice at his success and appreciate what heights he had achieved. From the very beginning of her son's career, she was with him and supported him in every possible way. Years later, the writer bitterly recalled, "There were bound galleys of Carrie. She was dying by that point, and she was too weak to hold a book, so her sister Evelyn read it to her, and Ruthie just said, 'My son wrote that.'" In 1973, after many improvements, the first copies of Carrie were sent out, for which the writer initially had to receive an advance payment of $1,500. As a result, Thompson convinced Doubleday to increase the advance to $2,500, which at that time was not a very high number for a debut novel. Thompson couldn't report the news by phone. It turned out that the Kings had turned it off. That's why he sent Stephen a telegram. Carrie officially a Doubleday book, $2,500 advance against royalties. Congrats, kid. The future lies ahead. Bill. According to King, with this advance, he bought a brand new Ford Pinto. The book was published on April 5, 1974 with a circulation of 30,000 copies. But that's not all. In May, the British publishing house New English Library received Carrie and its president Bob Tanner, after reading the book in a single night, sent a copy to the sister company New American Library. They offered Doubleday $400,000 for the rights to publish the book, half of which was intended for Stephen King. In his joy, he was looking for some extravagant gift to his wife, but he bought a hairdryer. So, in April 1975, they released a paperback edition which became a bestseller, reaching 4 million sales. Of course, it was not without the help of the film adaptation. After all, immediately after the release of the book, director Brian De Palma began to promote the idea of the film. He found out that at the time no one had bought the rights to the film adaptation, and he was very lucky. Work on the picture began only half a year later. The script of the film carefully followed the original plot of the book. Carrie was released in 1976 and with a budget of $1.8 million, collected $33.8 million at the box office, got positive reviews from critics, and became extremely successful.
I'm going, Mama. And things are going to change around here. With you.
The film is still considered a classic of the genre today and has been repeatedly reshot in attempts to surpass the outdated original. It is also worth noting that it was from Carrie that Stephen King's manifesto for banning firearms began. Teenage cruelty and shooting in American schools is a too frequent phenomenon to turn a blind eye to, and over the years the author paid more and more attention to this. But more on that later. Success is no accident, right? At least Stephen's success was not limited to one novel, but brought a whole wave of victories and new ideas. Since Carrie was going to be published for about a year, Stephen managed to sign a contract for the next year as a teacher. While teaching a fantasy and science fiction course for Hampton Academy students, King was inspired by Dracula, a novel by Bram Stoker. He wondered what would have happened if the vampires of the ancient world had come to a small New England town. One night over supper, I wondered aloud what would happen if Dracula came back in the 20th century to America. He'd probably be run over by a yellow cab on Park Avenue and killed, my wife said. So, there was an idea for a new King novel. He took up a new manuscript which was originally called Second Coming. Stephen called the finished book Jerusalem's Lot, but Tabitha considered the title more suitable for some vulgar romantic story, and the publishers considered it too religious and shortened it to Salem's Lot. Stephen received $550,000 for it. It was my favorite of my books, mostly because of what it says about small towns. They are kind of a dying organism now. The story seems sort of down home to me. I have a special cold spot in my heart for it. Later, the novel also received its adaptation in the form of a miniseries, and Stephen returned to the story of Salem a couple of times in the next few years in the short stories Jerusalem's Lot and One for the Road. Already at this moment, Stephen's stories began to form their own universe. Another bestseller, which received an excellent film adaptation, was also completed during that time period. After the death of Stephen's mother, the King family moved to Boulder, Colorado. Deciding to relax, they settled for a while at the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park. The writer recalled, "My wife and I went up there in October. It was their last weekend of the season, so the hotel was almost completely empty. They asked me if I could pay cash because they were taking the credit card receipts back down to Denver. I went past the first sign that said, 'Roads may be closed after November 1st, and I said, geez, there's a story up here.'" This is how the idea of the novel The Shining, about an alcohol-addicted writer who went crazy in a huge empty overlook hotel and whose dreams come true, appeared. The paranormal forces described in the book were called The Shining and later appeared more than once in other Stephen King novels. Stephen successfully combined his own impressions of relaxing in an empty hotel, the writer's experience, and his own growing dependence on alcohol in his book, and in January 1977, The Shining was published. King's third published novel became the first hardcover bestseller. This success firmly established Stephen as an outstanding author in the horror genre. And on February 21st of that year, the King family was replenished with a third child, who was named Owen Philip King. At this time, director Stanley Kubrick, disappointed by the failure of his last film, realized that he needed a film that would be commercially viable and artistic. Kubrick's staff brought him stacks of horror books where he settled into his office to find a suitable one for the film adaptation. King recalled, Kubrick's secretary heard the sound of each book hitting the wall as the director flung it into a reject pile after reading the first few pages. Finally, one day, the secretary noticed it had been a while since she had heard the thud of another writer's work biting the dust. She walked in to check on her boss and found Kubrick deeply engrossed in reading The Shining. Kubrick rejected Stephen's personal scenario adaptation and changed the narrative in the story quite a lot, which the author of the book did not really like.
He said, "Stephen, Stanley Kubrick here. Don't you agree that all stories of ghosts are fundamentally optimistic?" I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, if there are ghosts, it means we survive death, and that's fundamentally an optimistic view, isn't it?" And I said, "Well, Mr. Kubrick, what about hell?" And there was a long pause on the telephone line, and then he said in a very stiff and very different voice, "I don't believe in hell."
King believed in the traditional biblical distinctions of good and evil, where the role of evil was assigned to ghosts and demons. Kubrick had a much more pessimistic and subtle idea of what was meant by the word horror. Stephen was not happy that the director's Shining radically differed in some ideas from his own, but what could he do? Jack Nicholson was chosen for the main role, which seemed to be one of the best solutions for fans of the film, but it did not correspond to the writer's ideas at all. King believed that Torrance was inherently a good guy, quote, who was bent one way and then the other by various cosmic forces of evil. Kubrick masterfully blurred these generally accepted definitions of morality, making Torrance a psychopath. He thought the horror of humanity was much more convincing. The character of Jack Torrance has no arc in that movie. Absolutely no arc at all. When we first see Jack Nicholson, he's in the office of Mr. Ullman, the manager of the hotel, and then he's crazy as a shithouse rat. All he does is get crazier. In the book, he's a guy who's struggling with his sanity and finally loses it. To me, that's a tragedy. In the movie, there is no tragedy because there's no real change. Stephen King hated Kubrick's adaptation so much that in 1997 he took part in the creation of the eponymous 3-part TV series directed by Mick Garris. In addition, Stephen performed a small cameo role of Gage Creed, the orchestra conductor. It's safe to say that while the 1997 attempt was more faithful to the author's original book, it lacked Kubrick's cinematic skills. Nevertheless, Kubrick's film was one of the first to be shot with the help of the breakthrough technology at that time, Steadicam. And the picture turned out great. With a budget of $19 million, the film was well received by critics and audiences. Having collected $47.3 million at the box office, it became a cult classic and changed the whole genre of horror.
Here's Johnny!
Pop culture to this day is full of references to The Shining, and even Stephen in his much later novel The Institute mentions the film. After the novel's release, the King family returned to Auburn, Maine. There, Stephen finished working on the apocalyptic novel The Stand, about a terrible pandemic that wiped out part of humanity and its grim consequences. Does it remind you of anything? Fortunately, life is not so scary, and we do not live in the universe of the King of Horrors. The Stand was written for a long time. Stephen intended to create his epic in the spirit of The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien, whom he greatly appreciated. He could not figure out how the manuscript should end for a long time. There were too many characters and storylines. As a result, many of them thrown in the trash, and in the end, it all came down to a bomb that changed the outcome of all destinies. In 1978, Doubleday published the novel, and it was well received. But it was a little different from the book that Stephen originally wrote. The publisher insisted on reducing the material.
They had a price that they wanted to sell this book at that they considered to be absolutely top end. And considering the way that book prices are nowadays, you'll probably laugh, but as far as they were concerned, $12.95 was it. That was the ceiling, that was the top. And you might compare that to the price of the book.
After 10 years, Stephen still decided to return the discarded 400 pages of text, changed the order of the chapters, and moved the events to 1990. The reprint of the novel and the complete and uncut edition of The Stand turned out to be King's largest work, consisting of 1,152 pages. The novel sold 4.5 million copies, proving that Stephen could write not only in the horror genre, but also dark fantasy. The novel is considered one of the best by the writer, but most importantly, it also has a film adaptation, and not even one. The new serial adaptation was in time for the COVID-19 pandemic spreading around the world, and the novel has found a second youth. Stephen began to try himself in different genres, and over the next 5 decades, he tried himself in both the detective and fantasy genre, wrote a children's book, and even a memoir with tips on writing. By the end of the 70s, he decided to delve into dark fantasy and expand the world created in The Stand. So the idea of a whole series of King novels called The Dark Tower appeared. The first manuscript appeared in 1970, and the book was completed only 12 and a half years later and was released in a limited edition in 1982. But a full-fledged edition didn't appear for a long time. The writer put together a book of 5 separate stories that were very different from his usual creativity. There were really 2 reasons. One was I didn't think anybody would want to read it. It wasn't like the other books. The first volume didn't have any firm grounding in our world. In reality, it was more like a Tolkien fantasy of some other world. The other reason was that it wasn't done. It wasn't complete. I had a volume of work, and it was peg-legged. The novel was inspired by Robert Browning's poem, Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came, 1855, which Stephen read in his second year at the University of Maine. He tried to keep the idea and feeling of the poem in his work, but there were unsolved questions. What is this all about? What is this tower? Why does this guy need to get there? The book tells the story of the Gunslinger, Roland of Gilead, and his quest to catch the man in black to reach the Dark Tower. And when Stephen wonders what exactly Roland is looking for, he realizes that everyone keeps a dark tower in their heart that they want to find. They know it's destructive and it will probably mean the end of them, but there's that urge to make it your own or destroy it, one or the other. So I thought maybe it's different things to different people, and as I write along, I'll find out what it is to Roland. And I found that out, but I'm not going to tell you. The book was not as successful as other bestsellers that the writer published at that time, and it was quite difficult to write it. The second part of The Drawing of the Three was written only in 1987. Between it and the sequel, The Wastelands, 4 years passed, and the fourth book, Wizard and Glass, appeared in 6 years. But there were 2 reasons for that. The first was the writer's growing fascination with illegal substances. The second was the increased volume of books that followed The Gunslinger. In fact, without even knowing it, Stephen was creating his magnum opus. He liked to write about a world where feelings of mysticism and wonder were taken for granted. I was interested in postulating a world where there is magic. One of the liberating things about fantasy is that you can create that kind of world. If we talk about ghosts or demons or even flying saucers in our world, the skepticism comes built in. But if you create an entirely new fictional world, readers or people who participate in the creation of that world say, fine, let it exist according to its own laws. In addition, there were a lot of religious overtones and biblical images in The Dark Tower. There were significantly more ones than in other works of King. Stephen, who was raised as a Methodist as a child, lost faith in organized religion in high school and remains not very religious. However, he prefers to believe in the existence of God, especially after some events which we'll talk about later, so be sure to watch the video to the end. So, in an interview about The Dark Tower, Stephen said, quote, "I'm very interested in God, religion, and the afterlife, ethics, morals, and the part they all play. How much of God and the devil come from inside us, and how much of them are their own creatures. Above all else, I'm interested in good and evil, whether or not there are powers of good and powers of evil that exist outside ourselves. I think that the concepts of good and evil are in the human heart, but because I was raised in a fairly strict religious home, I tend to coalesce these concepts around God symbols and devil symbols, and I put them in my work." But let's not rush things and get ahead. The first 2 books of the Dark Tower series were almost unnoticed. At the same time, Stephen was amazed at the colossal success and the rapidly coming fame after The Shining. Poverty could finally be forgotten, because at that time he was earning millions. But at some point, the writer wondered if his stories were being sold because they were good, or because of his popularity and sensational name. Therefore, the next novel was published under the name of an unknown Richard Bachman. It was not the usual horror, but a psychological thriller, Rage, in which the topic of teenage cruelty was raised again and what it could lead to if you overreact. Stephen started writing this story in high school and finished while studying in college, because the story was old enough to check whether it would be successful. It did not become either successful or well sold, but it had some kind of fan base, and among this fan base were 2 teenagers capable of terrible things. Over time, Stephen, who declared the need to stop school shootings, said this in an interview.
I don't think that books or movies are ever the cause of this sort of violence. And I don't think that's true of video games either.
According to him, there are just people with problems, and it's not about books. If a person who is characterized by such actions does not find the cruelty he is looking for in a book, movie, or games, he will still find it in something else. It is worth noting that many doctors say the same thing. However, in 2013, Stephen decided to withdraw the book from all stores in print, and it was no longer possible to buy it. In 1979, Richard Bachman published his second novel, written by the writer for a long time, The Long Walk, and later 3 more new books titled Road Work, The Running Man, and Thinner. All of them were collected in 1985 in a hardcover collection, the Bachman Books. The author's pseudonym was made up of a surname in honor of the Canadian hard rock band Bachman Turner Overdrive, of which Stephen was a fan. The name was a reference to Richard Stark, the pseudonym of the writer Donald Westlake. Bachman's books were darker than King's usual au revoir. He called Bachman dark-toned, despairing, not a very nice guy. However, the books were sold, and the same Thinner was praised by critics.
We tried everything that we could think of to keep the secret, including this jacket photo here. I don't know if you can see that.
It's a fake photograph. Richard Bachman.
If you put this Richard Bachman up against me, you'll see that
There's not much similarity.
there's not much similarity. This Richard Bachman is a tire salesman from Minneapolis, Minnesota. He's a friend of my agent's.
By that time, many noticed similarities in the works of Bachman and King, but it was after the release of Thinner that one persistent seller from a bookstore in Washington, Steve Brown, claiming that Bachman is King's pseudonym, discovered the publisher's records in the Library of Congress, where Stephen King was listed as the author of one of Bachman's novels. The performance had to be ended, and a press release issued shortly after stated the death of Richard Bachman from cancer of the pseudonym, a rare form of schizonomia. Since then, Stephen returned to the pseudonym a couple of times with the words, "I found another Bachman book," when he considered the novel more suitable for Richard than for himself. When Stephen was able to quit his hated job in the laundry, said goodbye to teaching, when he began to receive money steadily with his books, he began to write even more. In the 80s, he had already published 2 books a year and could have published 3. He was finally able to dress properly, drove a brand new car, and often went to interviews since he became a celebrity. He liked to feed people's fears.
Somebody who's got problems and fears and phobias, they go to a psychiatrist and it costs them maybe $150 an hour, and they don't even get a full hour, they get 50 minutes. I do it, people pay me. It's great.
But visually, he looked like a character in some of his horror. Evil, as in Stephen's novel, all this time was getting closer and more gripping the writer, and he did not even notice how he began to turn into Jack Torrance, the alcoholic writer from The Shining. His addiction to drinking began in his school years when he got drunk for the first time at the age of 16. Then he promised himself not to do it again, but the next day, the story repeated. Since then, for 12 years, his addiction has only increased. King did not even notice how he got fat, he moved from alcohol to things even more harmful, and an evening rest on Friday turned into a rest on Monday, which did not please his wife at all. At one point, Tabitha said that she and the children love him and don't want to see his self-destruction, and if this continues, she and the children will leave. In addition, in the early 80s, Maine passed a law on the disposal of bottles and cans. Stephen began not to throw away Miller Lite beer cans, but to collect them in a plastic container in the garage. Unexpectedly, he discovered that in the middle of the week the container was already full. Stephen began to struggle with his problem. From that moment on, if he drank a can of beer, he poured the other cans in the refrigerator into the sink that evening. Otherwise, they called him even when he went to bed. In an attempt to escape from internal demons, Stephen took up a typewriter and began to splash out on paper everything that gnawed him from the inside. This was how the psychological horror thriller Misery appeared. It was the story about the writer Paul Sheldon, who, having gotten into a traffic accident, was held hostage by his crazy fan Annie Wilkes. Annie was the personification of evil, the personification of all Stephen's addictions that tormented him during his work. The heroine of the novel did the same in relation to the traumatized writer. Annie appeared to Stephen in a dream. Here's what he wrote on a napkin. She speaks earnestly but never quite makes eye contact. A big woman and solid all through, she is an absence of hiatus. I wasn't trying to be funny in a mean way when I named my pig Misery. No, sir, please don't think that. No, I named her in the spirit of fan love, which is the purest love there is. You should be flattered. The title of the book embodies both the name of the heroine of the novels of his fictional character and the state in which King himself was at that moment. According to him, Misery was supposed to be released under the pseudonym Bachman, but by that time his identity had already been revealed. Stephen and his wife decided to change the situation and stayed at Brown's Hotel in London. Then he wrote 16 pages of a steno notebook. The concierge kindly allowed him to work at a desk once owned by Rudyard Kipling, who died of a stroke while using it. After finishing the novel, Stephen told himself that he would stop being a tame writer for his addictions, and began to get rid of them. Misery won the first Bram Stoker Award for Novel in 1987 and was nominated for the 1988 World Fantasy Award for Best Novel. Critics were delighted with the book, frightening even without the presence of fantastic elements in it. And the film adaptation, which was released in 1990, directed by Rob Reiner, became an Oscar nominee film which won the Academy Award for Best Actress for Kathy Bates.
Are you sure? Because if you want, I'll bring back the whole store for you.
Annie, what's the matter?
What's the matter? I'll tell you what's the matter. I'd go out of my way for you.
And Stephen agreed with the success, calling this adaptation of the novel one of the best. In 2015, a theatrical play based on the novel was staged, starring Laurie Metcalf and Bruce Willis. It can be said that somewhere during this period of time, Stephen came to terms with the fame and glory and defeated the most terrible evil for himself. The only one who could harm him was himself. However, the difficulties in his life did not end, and there was still much to come. It's even surprising that during the years of his growing popularity and all kinds of addictions, Stephen did not just write works one after another, but he also surprised with the quality. Of course, his works have never claimed the Pulitzer Prize, but many fans of the writer stated that in those years he created his best novels. There was Carrie, The Shining, The Stand, The Dead Zone, Misery, Cujo, a collection of short stories, Different Seasons, Christine, Pet Sematary. Some said that all of Stephen's ideas came to him under the influence of banned substances, but they obviously did not understand what they were talking about. Without his talent and imagination, Stephen would not have written a single book in a drunken state. At least Stephen really likes the novel Cujo about a four-legged family member, a good-natured Saint Bernard who suddenly turns into a brutal killer. But he didn't remember how he wrote it at all. Just once during a visit to the auto repair shop, a Saint Bernard growled at him, which according to the owner happened often, and Stephen decided to show the dog that he was a good person.
Down, which you should never do to a dog, to Buster, to show him what a good guy I was. And Buster just went down on his haunches. I mean, dog was 150, 160 pounds. He just went down and he started to come up. And that guy brought that socket wrench down on him. It was like a rug beater hitting a rug. And the dog just shrank down, and there wasn't a word of apology. He just said, "Buster must not like your looks."
Although the mechanic stopped the dog, King recalled an incident published in a Portland newspaper when a little boy was killed by a Saint Bernard. The novel won the British Fantasy Award in 1982 and was adapted into a film a year later. Another Oscar-winning film adaptation was the film based on the short story Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption from the Different Seasons collection. The novel about a banker convicted of murdering his wife, which he did not commit, and who ended up in prison with brutal murderers, turned out to be quite unusual for Stephen King. 12 years later, the crime drama was adapted by director Frank Darabont and received 7 nominations for the Academy Awards, including Best Picture. Darabont is a big fan of Stephen and has worked with the author not for the first or last time. His career began at the age of 20 with a short film based on Stephen's story The Woman in the Room, acquired for $1 as part of the Dollar Baby program. Under this program, King helps students and young filmmakers retaining the copyright, but allowing them to film stories for just $1. 77 was the year young filmmakers, college students for the most part, started writing me about the stories I'd published, wanting to make short films out of them. Over the objections of my accountant, who saw all sorts of possible legal problems, I established a policy which still holds today. I will grant any student filmmaker the right to make a movie out of any short story I have written, so long as the film rights are still mine to assign. Darabont filmed the story and got the opportunity to work with A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors. His career took off and he returned to King to do something big with him. The director paid $5,000 for the film rights to Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption. The writer had no idea how to film a novel written in the first person, who was the narrator but not the main character. Nevertheless, the film turned out to be extremely successful, collected many nominations and awards, flattering reviews from critics, and took $73.3 million at the box office with a budget of $25 million. And besides, the film has gained popular love and has become a cult classic. Stephen, who never spent Darabont's $5,000, framed them and returned them to the director with the words, "In case you ever need bail money. Love, Steve." By the way, the other 2 excellent Darabont's adaptations of King's works were psychological horror novella The Mist and the novel The Green Mile, but more on that later. In 1979, Stephen was invited as a writer-in-residence at the University of Maine. The family settled in a rented house adjacent to the main road. Trucks often raced along it, and according to a neighbor, the road took the lives of many innocent animals. Cats and dogs often became victims of trucks. One afternoon, when his children were playing merrily in the yard of the house, the daughter's cat ran out into the road. Naomi followed it, and Stephen, who was nearby in the yard, miraculously managed to react and pull his daughter away from the truck rushing at her. the cat could not be saved, and Stephen had to bury the animal and explain the death of the pet to his daughter. 3 days later, Stephen wondered what would happen if one night your beloved pet returned from the dead. It would return fundamentally wrong. The writer was afraid to even imagine what would happen if something like this happened, for example, to his son. That's how the idea of the novel Pet Sematary appeared.
And now, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and comfort you and lift you up and give you peace. Amen.
Pet Sematary in some moments turned out to be extremely realistic and creepy. The novel is considered one of the scariest by the King of Horrors. Even Stephen himself believes that among all the books he has written, Pet Sematary is the most terrible. When he finished it, he was afraid to publish it and put the manuscript in a drawer. He decided to publish it only 4 years later when he had no other finished manuscript for the publisher. By the way, in addition to the fear of laundry and rats, Stephen is also afraid of elevators due to the fact that they hang in the elevator shaft and there is a void under them. And also, strangely, he is afraid of the number 13. He even wrote a story about it titled 1408. Stephen does not like to stay on the 13th floor of a hotel, and even on the 14th in cases when the management simply ignores the number 13.
You can't stay on the 14th because it's really the 13th. You're trying to confuse me, but I've been, I know about 13. You can't stop on page 247 in a book because if you add up those numbers, you come up with 13. You see?
Wait a minute.
And you can say to yourself...
Yes, you do.
Yes, that's right. Wow. 238, it's the same thing. You understand what I mean? The two bad numbers, as far as I'm concerned, are like 139, because that starts with a 13, and the three numbers add up to 13. And the absolute worst is 131. And I don't think I need to explain that, do I?
After all, the floor at the same time actually still remains the 13th. King's 80s were really rock and roll, with all his crazy passions, successfully film adaptations released on the screens. He even wrote a script and starred in a project called Creepshow, directed by another horror lover, George Romero. King has a lot of respect for this man. But he was also fond of music, which has always played an important role in the writer's life. So, in 1979, Stephen and Tabitha purchased Zone Corporation, a Central Maine broadcasting group which included the radio station WKIT on the 100.3 FM wave. This is a classic rock station called Stephen King's Rock Station, or the Rock of Bangor, since it broadcasts in this region of Maine.
I bought it because it was for sale and because it looked as though it was going to go to a kind of middle-of-the-road satellite transmission kind of thing, elevator music for yuppies sort of thing. And I like kick-ass rock and roll. So I bought the station, and it's an AM rocker, and we've stayed on the air with the help of maniacs like Doug here.
The radio station does not bring him profit, rather, but vice versa. According to the writer, there are thousands of ideas for investing much better than a radio station. But it all started with a childhood love for the songs of Elvis Presley, and since then, Stephen has fallen in love with rock and roll. He recorded the opening speech for the song Astronomy by the rock band Blue Oyster Cult. Together with Michael Jackson, created the script for the 40-minute music video for the song Ghosts, and helped a couple of other performers. And in his spare time, King could play the guitar himself. In the 92nd, his good friend, writer and producer Kathy Kamen Goldmark, for fun, suggested to King and a number of other famous writers to create a rock band. So, having gathered for the first time for the American Booksellers Association convention in Anaheim, the band Rock Bottom Remainders appeared, where Stephen played guitar. In addition to him, there was Dave Barry, Amy Tan, Ridley Pearson, Matt Groening, James McBride, Mitch Albom, Roy Blount Jr., and many others, including some professional musicians like Al Kooper and Roger McGinn. The group, assembled for one charity concert, existed for more than 20 years and periodically gave concerts right up to 2012. With a couple of ringer musicians on sax and drums, plus in the early days our musical guru Al Kooper at the heart of the group, we sounded pretty good. You'd pay to hear us. Not a lot, not U2 or E Street Band prices, but maybe what the old-timers call roadhouse money. Everything was fine with Stephen, and in the 90s, after getting rid of all kinds of addictions, he continued to create with renewed vigor. To this day, the writer remains absolutely clean, having given up everything in favor of his health. Stephen and his family lived in King's Mansion in the Victorian style near the center of Bangor. The houses in that area are all big and expensive to look at, but this red, beautiful house with white trim rises above the rest of the buildings in the neighborhood. The highlight is a small wrought iron fence decorated with spiders, creatures with bat wings, and a three-headed reptile. This is in King's style. Many of the works of that period became bestsellers, although they differed slightly in style and presentation of the author. If we consider all the works of Stephen King, they have become the golden mean in the author's work. They were more balanced, refined, and not always in the horror genre. In these years, such books as the large-scale novel It were published, about children growing up and overcoming their own fears in the fight against ancient evil, which awakened every 27 years in the image of the evil clown Pennywise. There was the novel Necessary Things, about an amazing shop with dream items, the novels Gerald's Game and Dolores Claiborne, about women trapped by circumstances, and the novel Bag of Bones, which won the 1999 Bram Stoker Award for Best Novel, the 1999 British Fantasy Award for Best Novel, and the 1999 Locus Award for Best Dark Fantasy/Horror Novel. The novel It became King's second largest novel, with 1,138 pages. And although critics were not thrilled with the number of sex scenes, readers were pleased and made the book a bestseller. The novel won the British Fantasy Award in 1987 and received nominations for the Locus and World Fantasy Awards. It also received several film adaptations, the last of which became a box office hit and with a budget of $40 million, collected $701.8 million at the box office. And the second part received another $473 million.
No one wants to play with the clown anymore. Play a game with me, would you?
And in addition to all the above, a mystical novel, The Green Mile, was published in 1996. Initially, the novel was published in 6 paperback volumes, but the following year it was republished in one book. It told the story of the meeting of the death row warden Paul Edgecombe with John Coffey, an unusual prisoner who had wonderful abilities for healing and empathy. The Green Mile won the Bram Stoker Award for Best Novel in 1996, and the following year the work was nominated as Best Novel for the British Fantasy Award and the Locus Award. Readers loved the book so much that in 2003 it was included in the BBC's The Big Read poll of the UK's best-loved novel. And as usual, the sales of the book were promoted by a great film adaptation, which was again shot by Frank Darabont.
I'm tired of all the pain I feel in here in the world every day. There's too much of it. It's like pieces of glass in my head all the time.
The film was nominated for 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, and also received many other awards and became a cult classic. Stephen even remembered one funny story, when an elderly woman approached him in a supermarket and said, "You are the horror writer. I don't read anything that you do, I just like things more genuine, like that Shawshank Redemption." To which he replied, "I wrote that." And she said, "And The Green Mile?" Stephen retorted, "That was also me." To which she replied with a dissatisfied, "No, you didn't," and walked away. In short, everything was going well for Stephen, and in any other story this could be summed up, but we are talking about one of the best storytellers of our time, so his fate seemed to have been written by someone from above, and the life of the incredible Stephen King could be cut short in a moment by one sultry summer day. His children, who had already grown up and were building their own lives, had just gathered at their parents' house. Together they celebrated the recent birth of Stephen's first grandson and planned to go to the cinema. Around 1630, June 19, 1999, the beloved author of millions of readers was doing his daily 4-mile walk. He walked 3 miles on the side of a dirt road and a mile along a highway in North Lavelle, Maine. He purposely went out for a walk early in order to have time to go to the cinema. At that time, a Dodge Caravan was speeding along the highway. Suddenly, his driver, Brian Smith, lost control and, swerving from side to side, flew into Stephen King, knocking him off his feet. The rider flew over the car, and Dodge flew into a ditch. The whole life flashed before Stephen's eyes, but after a second he realized that he was still alive. And before we continue, we recommend you subscribe to our channel and click on the bell to be one of the first to watch new videos and take part in our polls, so you will help us in the development and creation of new videos. We often ask and pay attention to the comments of subscribers about whose biography we should release next, so be sure to write us your suggestions in the comments to this video. The van's driver, Brian Smith, thought he had hit a deer until he found the rider's bent glasses in front of the seat of the car. The glasses survived. Stephen wears them to this day. But then, lying on the road, he gradually began to feel the pain coming through the adrenaline. The rider felt that something was wrong with his left leg. The man who knocked him down was sitting next to him with a relaxed look and smilingly reasoned that help was already on the way, that it was their fate that brought them together, and later told the investigator that he and a dog named Bullet went to the nearest store for Mars bars. Brian Smith was a terrible driver. Between 1989 and 1998, he was convicted 11 times for drunk driving and speeding. Only in 1998, his driver's license was suspended and restored 3 times. According to Stephen, at that moment he realized, "It occurs to me that I have nearly been killed by a character out of one of my own novels. It's almost funny." Stephen remembered the ambulance paramedic asking him which hospital he wanted to go to. The writer named Northern Cumberland Hospital in Bridgeton, where his youngest son Owen was born about 22 years ago. An ambulance took him there, but local doctors felt they could not provide all the necessary assistance, and Stephen was taken by air ambulance to Central Maine Medical Center in Lewiston. The paramedic of the ambulance promised King that he would not die. Only years later, he admitted to Stephen he thought that the writer would not even reach the hospital. Stephen was still alive, but the first minutes after the operation were a burden to him. "As I lay unconscious in the hospital, the docs debated amputating my right leg and decided it could stay on a trial basis. I got better. Every day of the 20 years since has been a gift." The operation was difficult. The writer's right leg was broken in 9 places below the knee, but Dr. David Brown gathered it and did not allow amputation. Plus, King had a broken hip neck and a shattered knee, 4 broken ribs, cracked spine, but all these were trifles compared to the possible outcome if he had not turned sideways before a collision with a car, or if he had hit his head on rocks sticking out of the ground by the side of the road. Only a week later, Stephen got to his feet and went to the toilet. The pain was hellish, and he couldn't even hold back his tears. Soon, he started physical therapy and left the hospital on July 19th of that year. All this time, King didn't want to write anything. He gave an interview in which he stated that he planned to end his writing career. It seemed to him that he would never return to work because of the pain. Nevertheless, when a week later at home, Stephen began to feel the energy and strength, he again had a desire to write. Besides, it was almost the only thing he could do in any position.
When you're in that situation, you don't feel much like writing. At the time of the accident, I had a book called On Writing that was about 3/4 done. And my wife, who's very wise, a lot of times she'll say to me, "You need to slow down, you need to take time off to enjoy all the good things in life that your good fortune is provided for you." And she knew after that accident that what I really needed to do to find my way back was to work.
Tabitha organized a work area for Stephen right in the back of the hall of their house, and he was able to finish his memoirs, adding to them this terrible story with a traffic accident. The story was really creepy. If you put together all the coincidences and details of the incident, much of this has either already been described by the author or will be used in further work. It started with the demonic vehicle and Christine and a dog named Bullet, who, like the monster from Cujo, contributed to a possible murder. And it ended with a plot from Misery that was almost a repeated plot of the writer's accident. According to him, nurses were told in no uncertain terms, "Don't make any misery jokes." King even bought the 1985 Dodge Caravan that hit him from Brian Smith for $1,500. He wanted to raise some money for charity by letting people crash the van for a small fee. But his wife Tabitha dissuaded him from having overly enthusiastic fans pounce on the souvenir. As a result, the car was sent to the landfill. Instead, the Kings have opened a new charity called the Stephen and Tabitha King Foundation and generously donate funds to other charities. After the accident, King donated $240,000 to charity to the rescue service and medical centers that helped him. He also created the Haven Foundation to help other writers, artists, and freelancers who cannot work due to injury or illness. In addition, he annually donates about $4 million to libraries, schools, and educational organizations for first aid items. For some time, Stephen was on painkillers but remained independent of them and stopped taking them as soon as his health began to improve. After the accident, Stephen seems to have been born again and protects his health like never before, unlike his offender, Brian Smith. He lost his license again after the accident and was given a half-year suspended sentence. Stephen was sure that by 2001 this guy would be driving again, but on September 21st, 2000, Brian Smith died. Yeah, he died on Stephen King's 53rd birthday. I was very sorry to hear the passing of Brian Smith. The death of a 43-year-old man can only be termed untimely. I would wish better for anyone. Our lives came together in a strange way. I'm grateful I didn't die. I'm sorry he's gone. Later, he used this story of his accident as a source of inspiration for the last novel of the Dark Tower series. The series, which lasted for decades before the road accident, quickly revived after it. With renewed vigor, Stephen finished the saga by 2012, releasing The Little Sisters of Illyria, Wolves of the Kala, Song of Susanna, The Dark Tower, and The Wind Through the Keyhole. He created a character named Brian Smith, clearly modeled after a real driver, but more reckless and stupid. In the novel, Smith was driving under the influence of illegal substances and was distracted by his dog. I'm impressed by something C.S. Lewis said about Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy. As good as Tolkien was at depicting good, he was much more effective at depicting evil. I think that's true, and I think that it's easier for all of us to grasp evil because it's a simpler concept, and good is layered and many-faceted. I've always tried to contrast that bright, white light of real goodness or godliness against evil. According to Stephen, of all that he wrote, The Drawing of the Three is his children's favorite book, who by that time began writing too. At first, Joseph engaged in it, who took the pseudonym Joe Hill so as to not use the popularity of a famous father. Since 1995, he began writing short stories, and by 2005, he had released his first novel, 20th Century Ghosts. Now he has 9 novels, and another one is on the way. However, he is still far from the speed and volume of Stephen's work. His youngest son, Owen King, joined the family's activities in 2001, also with stories. And by 2005, he also released his first collection of stories, We're All in This Together. In 2017, together with his father, he released a joint work, Sleeping Beauties, and also helped Stephen with the adaptation of The Stand into a miniseries for CBS. Do you think King's daughter doesn't write anything? Naomi became minister for the Unitarian Universalist Church of River of Grass in Plantation, Florida. Now she is Reverend Naomi Rachel King. She's also an LGBTQ+ activist, and yes, she has written several novels. And yet, Stephen King manages to remain productive even at his age, having survived an accident. In 2003, the writer was awarded the Medal for Distinguished Contribution to American Letters at the 2003 National Book Awards ceremony. Since the beginning of the 90s, he has released a wonderful mix of memoirs and writing tips. Entered the territory of Christine, in From a Buick 8, wrote for the first time the detective The Colorado Kid, the apocalyptic novel Cell, and the critically acclaimed psychological horror Lacey's Story, which is included in the list of the author's favorites. Lacey's Story won the Bram Stoker Award, and King dedicated the novel to his wife. I've always felt that marriage creates its own secret world, and only in a long marriage can two people at least approach real knowledge about each other. I wanted to write about that and felt that I actually got close to what I really wanted to say. Soon, Stephen wrote the novel Duma Key, the events of which for the first time took place not in Maine, but in Florida. Obviously, he also liked this state since in the early 90s the King family acquired a new house in Sarasota, Florida. It looked like it was the writer's dream home as he paid $8.9 million for a waterfront home on Casey Key, which was a record for this area. The house is very large and bright, with a view of the Gulf of Mexico, and has a wonderful library cabinet for the writer's work. In addition to the works already mentioned, Stephen wrote another book of 1,000 pages, the science fiction novel Under the Dome, which according to the classics shows that the greatest evil in our world is the people. The novel became a bestseller and was adapted into a 3-season television series.
Call FAA. Feds? Yes. They gotta shut down this whole airspace.
Okay, what if the government built this thing?
I doubt it.
Why?
Because it works.
Over the past 10 years, Stephen has released a collection of short stories. Full Dark, No Stars, a fantasy novel, 11/22/63, about the rescue of President Kennedy, nominated for the 2012 World Fantasy Award Best Novel, and also released a detective trilogy, Mr. Mercedes, wrote the long-awaited sequel to The Shining, Dr. Sleep, and returned to one of his favorite heroines, Holly Gibney, from the trilogy of Mr. Mercedes and the horror The Outsider. On September 5th, 2023, Stephen released a new novel. Holly is a full-fledged novel dedicated to the inimitable Holly Gibney. Other recent works of the author today are the novel The Institute, a collection of previously unreleased short stories, If It Bleeds, and the novel Fairy Tale. And many are wondering how Stephen King manages to write so much at his age.
How the fuck do you write so many books so fast? I think, I've had a really good 6 months. I've written 3 chapters, and you've finished 3 books in that time.
They asked this question directly to him. The answer is very simple. Stephen works as a writer and can't help but write. He writes on holidays, on Christmas, on his birthday. He writes every day, and he gets tired when he doesn't write. Although he admits that there are times when he takes a break for rest and time with his family, especially when Stephen had grandchildren. Now he has 5 grandchildren, and there is much less time to write. Nevertheless, his schedule is as follows. In the morning, he writes a new essay, which is now in the works. During the day, he rests and reads letters. In the evening, he reads and spends time with his family, edits what he wrote earlier, and watches Boston Red Sox games. He is a big Red Sox fan and even wrote the 2004 nonfiction book Faithful together with his friend, author, and club fan Stuart Onan about the historic 2004 Boston Red Sox season that culminated with the Red Sox winning the 2004 World Series. Stephen tries to write 2,000 words a day, or 10 pages, which is 180,000 words in 3 months and almost a finished book. Sometimes 10 pages are written easily, in 3 to 4 hours, and sometimes it takes half a day. At the best of times, Stephen wrote the book The Running Man in just a week. According to the writer, the secret of his success is in physical and psychological health, which in his case ensures marriage with his beloved wife. Answering George Martin's question, Stephen recalls a charity meeting in New York with John Irving and J.K. Rowling. It was in 2006 when Jo was just finishing the last Harry Potter book and everyone around her was pestering her with questions and requests for a sequel. But she wanted to have time to relax with her family and hold the event itself at the same time.
We were trying to talk about what we were going to do and everything, and the Scholastic Press publisher is pulling her aside and talking to her, and Jo is very polite. But when she came back and talked to me, she was really, really angry. And what she said was, "They don't understand what we do they?" And I said, "How can they understand when we don't understand?"
Despite his health problems and age, Stephen actively monitors the situation in the world, probably looking for themes for new works. He has always closely followed politics, supported Obama and Joe Biden in the elections, and fiercely criticized Trump, both in interviews and on Twitter, for which Donald took offense at him.
The last time I was here, I had a president who had just given me a National Medal of the Arts thing, which we argued over.
Yeah.
And now we've got a president who blocked me on Twitter. Except the court says he can't block anybody. So my question is, do I really want to follow that guy? I don't think so.
In 2013, Stephen published the nonfiction essay Guns about the problem of armed violence and the need to ban on assault weapons. And in 2014, he was awarded personally by President Barack Obama the National Medal of Arts for his contribution to writing. The topic of Russia's war against Ukraine also strongly affected the writer, and from the first days of Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, he actively supports Ukraine. On his Twitter account, King posted a photo and a t-shirt, "I stand with Ukraine," and later wrote that he refused to cooperate with Russian publishers. It's true that they withdrew his books from sales, making him an enemy of the country. But that's their problem. It's safe to say that many King fans don't want to imagine a timeline in which their favorite writer would never write such famous works as Under the Dome, 11/22/63, Revival, Mr. Mercedes, and Dr. Sleep, and would never have completed the saga of The Dark Tower. Stephen might not have lived to see the current resurgence of Hollywood's appetite for adaptations of his works, such as recent adaptations of It, Pet Sematary, Gerald's Game, Dr. Sleep, The Stand, and The Boogeyman. To tell the truth, there have been enough cool adaptations of Stephen's works, but in general, there are even more of them. Almost every work has its own adaptation. For some projects, Stephen himself created scripts and acted as a producer, and even appeared as an actor.
Refill, Ange? Thanks, hon.
And it's scary to imagine how many film adaptations the master of horror did not like. Here are just those about which it is known from the words of Stephen. The Shining, which we have already mentioned earlier. Firestarter, with a young Drew Barrymore in the role of a child with pyrokinetic abilities, where John Carpenter was even fired during production. The Lawnmower Man. And The Running Man had only the original name, and the finished projects barely resembled the source material. Graveyard Shift of 1990, in his opinion, was a cheap picture of the exploitation of workers. Dreamcatcher had a strange, difficult-to-understand plot. Their original was written under painkillers after a serious accident, and Stephen almost does not remember the writing process. Obviously, this contributed to the strangeness of the film. Maximum Overdrive is an incredibly expensive failure. King radically changed his own original story and turned it into a large-scale, ambitious sci-fi horror. The actions took place in a world where cars got out of control and started killing civilians. It was an absurdly cruel, unintentionally hilarious, and painfully prolonged product of rock and roll years of the writer. The Dark Tower is one of the last failed film adaptations, the problems of which speak for themselves. But let's be honest, it's not cheap or easy to film Stephen's work well. It's nice that over the years the quality of the Horror King's works has not decreased and he can still surprise the reader by trying new genres and mixing new ideas. He has a great feel for the psychology of people, and all his work is permeated with realism. The characters of his heroes are often literally copied from real people, and you easily believe in their existence. They seem to exist all this time in the world created by Stephen, in Maine, for example, in Castle Rock, and the author continues to investigate their behavior and conduct experiments. He could have died twice, but he overcame poverty, wealth, and death, earned worldwide fame by selling 400 million copies of his books, the respect of critics, and several dozen awards. Here he is, the King of Horror, Stephen King. And we wish him many more years of successful life, delight fans with his creativity, and remain the same interesting and bright person. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to support it with a like. And also, you can find on our channel many other interesting videos about talented actors of your favorite movies. And not only, how did J.K. Rowling create the ageless magic world of Harry Potter? Where did Miyazaki find inspiration for his wonderful cartoons? You will find answers to these questions and other questions in our videos. Click on the video that appears on your screen and learn a lot of interesting things. Our today's video came to an end. It was Biographer. See you soon.